This talk could really not come at a better moment for me. I'm scheduled to deliver my manuscript to Cambridge in 6 weeks. This is my first book, so you may be able to sense from my mood today a combination of euphoria and a heavy dose of anxiety as well. So what I'd like to do is take the opportunity to present to you some of the key findings of the book and to introduce you to these. I'd like to begin with the events that took place in Berlin on June 3rd, 1931. So June 3rd, 1931 was a bad, but not exceptional day during the final years of the Weimar Republic. At approximately 10 a.m. in the morning, bricks flew through the windows of a grocery store near Alexanderplatz. Seconds later, witnesses observed a group of young men running from the scene and jumping into a taxi, which then vanished into the stream of traffic. A short distance away, at an approximately the same time, 8 men entered a different grocery store and made away with a large quantity of sausage and bacon. As the day progressed, looting bans in other parts of the city became more violent. At midday in North Berlin, a female shop clerk tried to take a stand against the looters, and they threw her brutally to the ground. A crowd near city center beat, kicked, stabbed a police officer trying to arrest a looter. And towards evening, bike-riding vandals broke more store windows near City Hall. In North Berlin, police searched for arsonists who had set fire to posting columns filled with advertisements and election posters. And during the evening hours, members of the Nazi SA marauded down the main shopping streets in West Berlin, chanting "Jews out of Germany" and shoving pedestrians. One of the SA men waved a gun. So I first encountered the events of June 3rd, 1931 as a series of teletype messages. Strips of thin paper were glued to a piece of paper in a police file. Precincts from all over the city had sent these reports over the wire to police headquarters at Alexanderplatz. At headquarters, officers literally tried to piece together what was happening. Most notable was the effort by police to fit these episodes into a more familiar narrative, one about street clashes between communists and Nazis, a phenomenon that contemporary commentators increasingly refer to as a latent civil war. But as I was sitting there in the Berlin Municipal Archives, I had one of these moments, a moment that perhaps many of you can relate to, when you're researching and suddenly your heart starts to pound a little bit faster, and you can even seem to feel the wheels of your mind accelerate. And this was my moment, because I noticed, first of all, how awkwardly these incidents fit into the police's paradigm of explanation. Because the primary targets of these attacks were not political enemies, but instead sites of consumption. At the same time, I realized how much these incidents upended the paradigms of my own research. These incidents caused me to rethink my research in 3 fundamental ways. So in brief, first had to do with chronology. I was in Berlin working on a dissertation on the development of consumer culture during the Weimar Republic. Then, and even now, much of the research on consumer culture tries to explain the rise of mass consumption. It typically focuses on periods of economic growth. But I asked myself, what if I shifted the chronology of my study to emphasize periods of political and economic instability? How might that challenge the assumptions about the irresistible rise of mass consumption? How might it present an image of alternative capitalist modernity? My second revelation had to do with space. If I shifted my methodology to focus on city streets, could these spaces help integrate the story of consumer culture with the dominant political narrative of the period? That is, the collapse of liberal democracy and the rise of Nazism. And the third has to do with perception. Historians often take for granted political and economic crisis as the primary cause for the collapse of the Weimar Republic and the rise of National Socialism. In recent years, some scholars have challenged their fellow historians to stop using the term crisis as a simple fact or a shortcut when trying to explain these turning points in German history. And yet we know that perception of crisis was ubiquitous during this period. So the question is, how can urban space help us understand how perceptions of crisis formed, and also to better understand the consequences of these perceptions? So I'd like to discuss now how my book answers these questions, and to essentially go through them one by one. And in the process, also give you a glimpse of the vibrant, volatile, and lost topography of interwar Berlin, which is such a central feature of my book. In other words, my book moves city streets to the forefront of analysis rather than treating them as mere backdrop or setting. So let's begin with the first argument of the book, which deals with issues of chronology and periodization. In my book, I argue that distinct cultures of consumption emerged during periods of economic and political instability, and that these had their own logic, values, and practices. In other words, we should not assume that desire, choice, abundance, and the free market represent inviolable or even essential principles of consumerism or even capitalism. Instead, we should integrate discontent, scarcity, deprivation, and even violence into the center of the story. This is a significant departure from much of the existing literature. I came to this topic of consumer culture originally because I found, and I still find, the work of theorists like Walter Benjamin and Siegfried Kracauer utterly compelling. As many of you know, these authors already in the 1920s invested cultural changes brought forth by industrial capitalism, such as the formation of new mass identities around consumption. When I began my research, however, few historians of Germany focused on consumption as a major topic. By comparison, historical writing was far more robust regarding the rise of mass consumption and consumer society in the United States. It was a major historical research topic since the early 1980s. What many of these US centered studies tried to explain was how the practice of consumption, particularly mass consumption, became a transformative and pervasive force in the modern world, shaping economic structures and even the notions of the self. So when I was starting out on my dissertation research, my goal was to do for Germany and to do for Berlin what some of these studies had done for the United States. That is, tell a story about the places and the things that heralded mass consumer society. For example, illustrated magazines, decadent department stores, electrified boulevards, and exotic movie palaces. And yet, as I was sitting there in the archives, imagining bricks sailing through and shattering display windows, I had a realization. Works about consumer culture typically emphasize the 1890s, the mid-1920s, and the 1950s. That is, eras of economic growth. Therefore, I shifted my chronological focus to encompass the entire period between 1914 and 1945. And in doing so, I show that in Berlin, the iconic features of modern consumer culture ceased to function as signs of stability and prosperity. Instead, economic dysfunction inverted each feature and projected volatility, division, a sense of beleaguerment, and victimization. The war economy darkened streetlights and shuttered nightlife, Widespread unemployment and intensifying paramilitary actions triggered the shattering of display windows, waves of looting, particularly at the beginning and the end of the Weimar Republic, and illicit advertising and transient street hawking flourished in a climate of inflation and instability and municipal insolvency. So I want to pause here and discuss street hawking in more detail as an example of alternative consumer culture. And just to flash back for a moment, in the course of the 19th century, municipal regulations, along with structural changes in the means of production and distribution, increasingly pushed commerce out of the streets and other open public spaces into enclosed markets and retail shops. From 1875 to 1914, the number of retail outlets in Germany rose from nearly 500,000 to well over 1 million. Major commercial innovations of the period reflected and depended upon this enclosure of retail. The display window, interior design, the shop counter, fixed prices, advertising, and chain stores. But after the First World War, commerce literally turned inside out. The street became a major site of buying and selling, again, for a number of reasons. Street commerce offered a chance to respond flexibly to unpredictable political and market conditions. It required no major investment of capital. Hawkers could sell in small quantities, clothing, food, or individual matchsticks and cigarettes. Street hawkers could seek out reluctant customers. They could insert themselves into the stream of traffic. Chains of hawkers lined boulevards and bottlenecked sidewalks. Hawkers could respond to the needs of busy urban dwellers, anticipate their movements, and also their desires. So newspaper sellers would race on bicycles or roller skates to the liveliest corners. They would occupy traffic hubs, and they would also loiter outside the entrances to public toilets. Hawkers could speculate on a daily basis, depending on seasons, market surpluses, current events, or even the weather. And so you can see in this image, in the center and above, hawkers selling revolutionary postcards and pins as souvenirs less than 1 day after Ebert's proclamation of the Republic in November 1918. Just on a mundane level, a hawker could sell umbrellas on a rainy day. Some of you may have experienced that before in New York. All of a sudden it rains and the hawkers come out to sell the umbrellas. Moreover, officials could do very little about it. The public often took sides against police who hassled street hawkers, in no small part because many of them were in uniform and displayed war injuries. Officials also saw hawking as a cheaper form of welfare. So the municipality could provide space as a resource in lieu of providing unemployment benefits. This infuriated shopkeepers who saw lively street trade and empty shops as an immoral perversion of the commercial order. Despite their expressed political commitments to private property and capitalism, they had little interest in free market or laissez-faire principles. In their protests and petitions, shopkeepers described themselves as respectable taxpayers and described hawkers as exploitative, subversive, criminal, and unhygienic. And also, they saw hawkers as a perversion of the historical development of commerce, a natural evolution as they saw it. On the one hand, shopkeepers saw the explosion of hawking as a return to pre-modern commercial conditions. On the other hand, they blamed its excessive outgrowth, and that's actually their term, excessive outgrowth, on the lost war and revolution. A DNVP representative in Berlin's Municipal Assembly argued that such disorder would have been impossible under the Kaiser, and was a consequence, and this is a quote, of the freedom that November 9 brought to the street. Shopkeepers wanted aggressive police intervention against hawkers and even their customers. Street hawkers, on the other hand, appealed to the officials by invoking the values of the Republic. They saw their claim to the street as an expression of democratic rights and values. And their political lobbying organizations took a firm stance that the enemy was on the right. For example, before the 1925 presidential election, a street hawker publication warned, this is a quote, "Itinerant trade has to decide on April 26 whether they want to put in the saddle an ossified, militaristic, bureaucratic system or whether a free and democratic system should govern." In the early 1920s, many municipal authorities either accepted the validity of street hawkers' arguments or recognized their own incapacities to enforce order, and then granted greater access to the street space to make a living. Officials opened up all but 28 of Berlin's streets to hawking. But there was a very important exception to this. Police regularly and aggressively raided a narrow network of streets not far from police headquarters at Alexanderplatz, an area known as the Scheunenviertel. This was a poor district. It had one of the highest population densities and crime rates in Berlin. It was becoming a communist stronghold. The district supported a dense and diverse street trade. And you can see this depicted here in the left upper image. And in this street trade, a breathtaking array of goods was on offer. Bread, leather jackets, jewelry, tobacco, soaps, bicycles, even diamonds. One critic likened it to a department-style store business, except it was out in the open, under the open sky. The district was a target of criticism and condemnation, and a focal point for debates about the post-war moral geography of commerce for all of the reasons that I just gave you. But then there was one more. The district was also the center for immigrant and refugee life for Jews from Eastern Europe. In the first years of the Weimar Republic, officials in the Ministry of Interior, as well as Berlin police, complained about a deluge of foreigners from Eastern Europe. Now, reliable statistics are hard to get on these refugees and migrants. Our best numbers come from two major censuses that were taken during the period, in 1910 and again in 1925. And the census records suggest that between these two accountings, the populations of Jews without German citizenship in all of Germany increased by 30,000. So officials complained vehemently about this deluge of arrivals, but they did not pursue mass deportation for several reasons. One had to do with the lack of personnel to carry out such a mass action. They simply did not have enough officials to do it. Secondly, concern about further weakening the image of Germany in international opinion. And then also some humanitarian sympathies, because many of the refugees had fled violence and had no safe place to return to. Therefore, officials, rather than pursuing mass deportation, turned to other, more targeted measures to deport so-called burdensome foreigners. From a policing standpoint, the targeting of illegal foreigners and the suppression of illegal trade functioned as complementary tactics. Street hawking was a profession that was attractive to migrants. It required only meager capital, language skills, and also legal documentation. Moreover, people in transit often had to sell possessions. Many migrants hoped not to stay in Germany, but to continue on to other destinations, particularly the United States, but then became stuck because of either their own poverty or also tightening immigration restrictions, for example, in 1921 and 1924 in the United States. At the same time, street hawking made foreigners more visible and also more vulnerable as they practiced their trade in public space. Despite more liberal concessions to street hawking after 1918, it was forbidden in most of the Scheunenviertel district. In the early 1920s, police conducted raids and dragnets in the Scheunenviertel, in part to show shopkeepers and the broader public that they were taking action against these so-called burdensome refugees. But these actions also fueled tensions between the neighborhood and police. And at the same time, police actions in the Scheunenviertel and reporting on these in the press reinforced perceptions that Germany's significant post-war economic woes could be traced back to this district and the refugees and immigrants that congregated there. So there's ways in which there was this symbolic geography and police practices were mutually reinforcing. Grassroots and institutional hostility towards this district and a segment of its population hit a peak during the hyperinflation. On November 5th, 1923, during the height of the inflation and in a context of broader unrest, property crime, and violence, a pogrom took place in the Scheunenviertel. And it began with an attack on a street hawker. It quickly encompassed shops, and you can see here in this bottom image, shopkeepers and police's response to this riot. Police cordon off and occupy the area. Shopkeepers close, pull down iron shutters to protect their display windows, and leave the area. And some have also put up signs reading Christian business, which they imagine will deter looters and vandals. So after the pogrom, broken glass and looted goods littered the streets. 2 were dead, more than 40 injured. Hundreds faced charges, including several police officers accused of abusing German Jewish veterans who had rushed into the district to protect their co-religionists, faced attack from the mob, and sought rescue from the police. Instead, they were hauled into custody, these veterans, and insulted and abused on the way. The pogrom shows a confluence of radical politics against foreigners, against Jews, against post-war economic order, against perceived corrupt commerce, and these overlapping stances projected onto space. Moreover, it reveals the use of violence to impose a xenophobic, racist, and exclusionary moral geography a full decade before the Nazis came to power. And yet afterwards, there was widespread sentiment in the press and among public officials that mob action and police failures had defiled Berlin and its liberal, democratic, and cosmopolitan reputation. So it was not yet April 1933, nor November 1938, moments when this district again became a flashpoint for violence, but with no similar expressions of regret or remorse, for the very simple reason that the Nazi regime instigated these later attacks. But the Nazis were working with an ingrained symbolic geography that preceded their rule. So the explosion of street hawking after the First World War and the Scheunenviertel riot reveal different sides of a larger point about consumption in a period of political and economic instability. During the Weimar Republic, retailers, advertisers, political parties, and government officials put forward visions about how mass consumption should function. Some of these visions included the exclusion and restriction of competition and the disciplining of customers. The use of intimidation and violence to do so would become a prominent part of the story during the Nazi period. But there were already Weimar precedents. And these actions show us that during the time, critics and competitors did not see street hawking as a mere aberration from normal market conditions that would easily and naturally return, but rather as something that had to be actively suppressed with force if necessary. At the same time, hawkers and their advocates welcomed relief from previous modes of commerce and consumption that they found elitist and oppressive, and they wrapped their appeals in the banner of democracy. This brings me to the second major argument of the book. While the first argument focuses on chronology, the second is an argument about space. The example of the Scheunenviertel riot, like the examples of looting that I began with, are extreme examples of a larger phenomenon of the period, and that is the way that streets connected commerce and politics. The major methodological point of my work is basically this. Streets were the most significant urban mass media of the time. I argue that the freedoms granted by the 1918 German Revolution transformed the streets into the primary medium of communication, lens of perception, and stage of action for both political and economic life. And unlike print, film, or radio, neither the barrier of price nor the taste of consumers limited the potential audience. But key to this is also the understanding that the streetscape was crowded. After the First World War, political parties and commercial entrepreneurs took to the streets and fought for the attention of crowds with posters, light displays, parades, traffic obstructions, and violence. Their competition for space and impact transformed the urban environment. And I'd like to focus for a moment on two examples of this competition for attention: advertising and demonstrations. I would start off by reminding that before the First World War, the licit sites of political expression were interior spaces, the lecture hall, the pulpit, and the newspaper. Those who challenged this order with strikes and demonstrations faced fines, arrest, and bodily injury. Moreover, commercial exploitation of public space was a well-established phenomenon that to a large extent came into being to help suppress political expression. Since the aftermath of the 1848 revolutions, Berlin possessed a centralized advertising infrastructure, posting columns, also known as Litfaßsäule. These allowed government officials and commercial advertisers to communicate with Berlin's residents and visitors. With their standardized format and legally protected surfaces, the columns provided and proved essential to the development of modern commercial advertising. At the same time, the columns offered a spatial means to restrict and confine communication, to keep illicit notices off walls, fences, buildings, and trees. But inspired by the lifting of censorship in November 1918, individuals that I refer to as rogue pasters seized not only posting columns to express their opinions and agendas, but also public buildings and private spaces. During election season at night, rogue pasters covered display windows of retail stores, particularly in high-traffic areas. Shop owners and employees lined up at windows every morning with water and scrubbers and cursed as they tried to remove posters. The only comfort, according to one observer, was the schadenfreude of watching everyone on the street, neighbors and competitors, busy at the same task. Another commentator sitting at a coffee shop near the rail station at Friedrichstrasse described seeing the same wall space covered with 12 different posters in the course of an hour. And not just political ones, also ones for public dances and for boxing matches. Particularly clever rogue pasters brought with them ladders in order to keep posters out of reach. An essential point here is that commerce and politics shared a common urban geography after 1918, that of the streets. And this common geography makes it necessary to reimagine the political discourse of both the Weimar Republic and the Nazi era, namely how a dynamic, volatile urban environment shaped it in terms of content, practice, regulation, and reception. Election campaigns and propaganda look quite different from this angle. We should not imagine these posters in the pristine state that we find them in illustrated histories, museum exhibitions, or the archives. this is not how the public encountered them in the street. Election posters appeared side by side on posting columns and walls. They competed for impact not only with each other, but also with commercial advertisements. Wind and rain battered them. Bored children scratched them to pieces. They often disintegrated into tatters and fell into gutters as scraps. And a similar phenomenon is true for demonstrations. Photographs of these center on participants. But instead, when we think about posters and demonstrations, we should imagine the whole urban world that surrounded them. For example, the toothpaste advertisement that bordered on a Hitler billboard, the grocery store display windows that lined parade routes, the cigarette hawker who stood side by side with a partisan newspaper seller. Such a perspective qualifies any reading of propaganda by emphasizing the cacophony of voices in public space. In other words, streets bring together politics and consumer culture, which historians of the Weimar Republic often treat as distinct topics or separate chapters of their works. And this cacophonous public space has explanatory potential. Shared geography fundamentally shaped publicity practices. Arresting the crowd's gaze was a fundamental principle for both mass commerce and mass politics. Commercial entrepreneurs honed many of the tools of mass communication that partisans later copied for their own ends. First the poster, but also the sandwich board, the motorcade, the search, and the spotlight. During the 1920s and 1930s, poster captions shrank in content but amplified in shrillness. And this was true for commercial advertisements and campaign posters as well. These strategies were desperate bids for attention in the midst of depressed consumption and frequent election battles. But these strategies also served as a defensive reaction against spiraling competition for viewers' attention within a riotous cityscape. Crowded and competitive public space limited the transmission of any message. And at the same time, the transmission of messages entirely depended on intersecting and disrupting urban traffic. Political groups targeted commercial sites because of their ready-made crowds. The collision between politics and commerce was therefore coincidental, but it was also intentional and instrumental. Protesters endowed these sites with ideological meaning and staged their actions there accordingly. In the early 1930s, National Socialists, for example, menaced the commercial elite on Kurfürstendamm in West Berlin, as well as hawkers and petty shopkeepers in the Scheunenviertel in East Berlin, as part of their strategy to expose the alleged Jewish infiltration of the capital. At Christmas time, the communists invested the same streets with a different political meaning. They marched from the poor East to the elegant West to show the disparity between the industrial classes. And this brings me to my third point. My book argues that struggles over urban space shaped, linked, and magnified perceptions of crisis. What is important here to remember is that crisis is not a physical reality. One cannot encounter crisis directly, but rather only signs and manifestations. And these must be observed and interpreted. Crisis is therefore a subjective perception. It depends on the construction of meaning. It is an interpretation. The question is then, how do perceptions of crisis form? Throughout the Weimar and the Nazi era, Berliners, as well as many international observers, turned a watchful eye to the streets. They saw streets and the city as a barometer of the mood and the health of a nation, as well as a bellwether for global affairs. Therefore, disruptions and disturbances in the streetscape contributed to a moment of deep uncertainty. about the future of the German state, fears about the stability of the international order, and even questions about the future of capitalism. Because interwar governments recognized this power of urban space, either to bolster or shatter their legitimacy, authorities pursued increasingly radical policies to renew the city and promote the appearance of harmony and abundance. I argue that it would be impossible to understand Albert Speer's plan for Germania without this prehistory of the streets. These plans by Hitler's architect to eradicate Berlin and replace it with a new monumental capital of Germania were as much of an expression of the frustrations with existing public spaces and the kinds of crowds and behaviors that these produced as they were an expression of architectural hubris. Nazis were entranced by the powers of the street as media. In his 1932 memoir, The Struggle for Berlin, Joseph Goebbels attributed much of the growing success of the Nazi Party to its innovative use of city streets for propaganda. The street, Goebbels wrote, is now the primary feature of modern politics. Whoever can conquer the street can also conquer the masses, and whoever conquers the masses will thereby conquer the state. And yet the Nazis would be perpetually disappointed in their ability to control the streets even after coming to power. As political latecomers to Berlin, the Nazis inherited the built environment, its residents, and their existing sensibilities. In other words, the Nazis staged aggressive political theater, but they did not build the stage. They did learn how to appropriate Berlin's modern commercial infrastructure to serve their purposes. Essentially, to continue the metaphor, to manipulate the set pieces. For example, the Nazis relied on posters and display windows to promote and execute the April 1, 1933 boycott of Jewish businesses. They relied upon patterns of moving and looking in the city that had been established by commercial practices and infrastructures. And they essentially weaponized these for the sake of ideology. And still, it proved difficult to graft the fascist state onto Berlin's streetscape. The streetscape had taken shape in a different context: constitutional monarchy, liberal democracy, and market-based capitalism. The Nazi government attempted a number of urban revitalization projects that aimed to harmoniously integrate consumer culture with political ideology. One example of this was the Christmas market at the Lustgarten in 1934, when they brought a nostalgic holiday market to downtown. Or the preparations for the Olympic Games in 1936, which largely consisted of hiding Berlin's streetscapes from view. You'll notice in these images how much flags obscure the actual facades of the city. They are the focal point. Of course, this emphasizes Nazi symbols, but it also makes it very hard to have a panoramic view of the streetscape. This was entirely intentional. With each of these examples of urban revitalization projects, the dominant response in internal correspondence among Nazi officials was disappointment. A disappointment with the architectural raw materials of Berlin, with the crassness of its commercial entrepreneurs, with the infighting between different government offices, with the petty economic opportunism of party members, with the attitudes, behaviors, and taste of the public. Particularly, consumers' willingness to forsake Nazi ideological principles for the sake of best price, best product, or best service. Therefore, we should see Albert Speer's plan for Germania as an urban fantasy that responded to the recent past. Germania was a politicized streetscape, but unlike the Weimar Republic, its surfaces were stripped bare of posters. Instead, raw architecture was the political message. The transience of paper replaced by the permanence of marble. Germania also had a commercialized streetscape. Despite the staggering scale of the plan's monuments and government palaces, it actually devoted a majority of the street space to leisure and consumption, with movie theaters, operas, restaurants, pools, and hotels. And this is another story, and one that's somewhat hard to imagine, but there was supposed to be a lot of neon lights, neon advertising in this Germania. The plan imagined the city as a major tourist attraction. The National Socialist Plan foresaw dedicating this capital in 1950 to commemorate German victory in the Second World War. And Hitler hoped to hold a World's Fair then, to draw many thousands of tourists to the capital and showcase Germania as a model fascist world city. A desire to present this as a victorious post-war capital filled with abundance that was such an antithesis to the defeated Berlin after World War I. And yet the plan did not account for the kinds of crowds and commotion typical of the 20th century metropolitan streetscape. It even actively suppressed them. The plan moved buying and selling off the streets and into interior courtyards and arcades. Models did not integrate crowds more diverse than soldiers on parade. Indeed, the plan banned all normal traffic from the Grand Avenue. Lifeless streets and dead spaces would have pervaded the Nazi capital, even a triumphant one spared of aerial bombardment. Berlin's interwar streetscapes did not survive. They were erased by Albert Speer's seizure of Jewish property in the aftermath of Kristallnacht, demolitions in the city center to prepare the urban canvas for Germania, Allied bombing during World War II, and post-war reconstruction under disparate regimes. All that remains are infrastructural outlines and the occasional lonely ruin. And yet, despite their eventual destruction, these spaces and their history poses questions that remain relevant to this day. Historians perpetually return to this period of German history, not only for greater insight into the past, but also for greater insight into the condition of modernity and our own times. As I've continued working on this project, I see resonances everywhere. Perhaps this is just the obsession or myopia that comes from being deeply involved in a research project, but it's also more than that. I see resonances in the way that police and the press struggled with the question over whether politics or just opportunism motivated looters in 2011 in London or Baltimore in 2015. I see resonances in the potential use of minor offenses to ensnare undocumented immigrants, which has caused Los Angeles to rewrite municipal codes in 2017 to decriminalize street hawking. And in the struggle to integrate new forms of media into political discourse, such as Facebook news feeds, comment sections, and Twitter. And the ways that these new media forms enhance the feeling of democratic participation and at the same time fracture, fragment, and unsettle democratic discourse. And resonance is also in the way that despite all these new forms of media, and even because of them, the city street remains the last venue of last resort to break through the chatter and express visibly and physically either acclamation or dissent. Even in daily life, the street is still the most direct and physical point of interaction between citizen and state. which raises for us big questions. Who owns the street in a democracy? The people or the authorities? If the people, then how far does the claim of an individual or a group go before it infringes upon, excludes, exploits, or endangers others? If the authorities, then how do officials regulate and manage in a way that stops short of authoritarianism? These were questions already during the Weimar Republic, and they remain with us today because city streets were the foundational spaces for the development of mass consumer society and mass politics. City streets remain essential to the practice and the imaginary of both. As I said at the beginning of this talk, this was not the book I intended to write. I intended to write a book about advertising, department stores, movie palaces. And yet I found myself immersed in revolution, discontent, and violence. Is this simply a function of Germany's particular history? Or is it because the modern urban order is far more fragile than we realize? As I complete this project, I remain truly amazed that millions of diverse people can live side by side in a completely constructed and artificial environment. This is what makes cities so dynamic. It also makes them precarious. In times of prosperity and stability, city streets recede into the background. We hardly notice them. They become naturalized part of the landscape, something we move through but we don't really see. The moments when we do become aware of them, those can thrill us. The moment when we sense an entrepreneurial opportunity or feel the jolt of citizenship by taking a stand and occupying the streets. But there are also those moments when we become aware of them because streets reveal to us the deeper rifts in our society, our economics, and our politics. And these moments can be deeply unsettling and even terrifying. Berlin streets remind us of this. They lay bare the contested period of history when people became intensely aware of the urban environment, both its promises and its dangers.